Welcome everyone. The Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is pleased to host the Southeast Coastal Climate Network's webinar series. On behalf of states and the Southeast Coastal Climate Network, I'd like to thank you for being with us today. It is your interest and support that make our work possible. Before we get started today, I'd like to take just a moment to review the basic functions of the control panel on your screen. If you'd like to minimize your control panel, just select the orange arrow in the left-hand corner and then select that again to display the panel. To ensure sound quality, all the attendee lines have been muted throughout this presentation, but we encourage you to type in your questions using the questions box on your control panel. We will then answer all of the questions at the very end of the presentation today. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I would like to acknowledge all of our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org. And I would now like to introduce Chris Carnival, State's Coastal Climate and Energy Coordinator and Manager of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. My name is Chris Carnival, and I'm the manager of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network. As you can see on the current slide, the Southeast Coastal Climate Network is a coalition of individuals and organizations spanning the coastal Southeast who are working on coastal responses to climate change. We have members as far north as Maryland and as far west as Louisiana. The purpose of the network is to bring voices together, to trade information, and to synergize our efforts. The Southeast Coastal Climate Network is hosted under the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Our largest tool is our group site website, which is an online platform that enables members to send group emails, post discussion topics or relevant news to discussion boards, and use a shared group calendar. If you're interested in joining the network and using these tools, please just visit the web address on the screen now, seccn.groupsite.com, and click Join this group now. For those of you on this webinar who are already members, I want to encourage you to use these tools to help get your message out. The purpose of the group is to encourage communication and collaboration, and you have a receptive group of people at your fingertips, so please don't be shy and do use these tools. Another great tool we have is our webinar series, of which today's webinar is a part. Today we're joined by my colleagues Angela Garoni and Jennifer Renix from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy to discuss recently released carbon pollution limits for the power sector. This topic is incredibly important for those working in the realm of climate and energy. The power sector accounts for a large portion of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, which ultimately fuels climate impacts that are so acutely felt in the coastal southeastern states, such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, and extreme weather, including heat waves and flooding events. Given the role of the power sector in our greenhouse gas emissions, regulating carbon emissions is a major opportunity for updating and improving our energy portfolio, particularly in the Southeast, where a large portion of our electrical generation is provided by carbon-intensive coal-fired power plants. Our first presenter, Angela Garoni, is the Southeast Energy Research Attorney at SACE, where she works on coal plant issues with our southeastern utilities. Angela received her JD with an environmental law certificate from Pace University in New York and attended George Washington University in Washington, D.C. for her Energy Law LLM. Following Angela's presentation, we will hear from Jennifer Renix. Jennifer directs the federal policy and communication efforts of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, serving as the primary liaison between SACE's programs and our region's congressional offices, federal agencies, and media outlets across our region. With that, I'll turn it over to Angela.
Great, thanks Chris, and thanks Erin, and also thank you everyone who has joined today. I'm going to start by asking everyone to put their thinking caps on, as this is a very technical and long rule that we're still continuing to dig in on, and EPA will continue to release guidance and webinars throughout the summer to further elucidate the nuances of this rule. So I thought I would start out today with a bit of a how did we get here. As Chris said, this is a very important rule, and as many of you on the call know, this was a long road and will continue to be a little longer until we have effective and implementable final regulations. But as a little background, some of you know the authority where EPA got the ability to actually regulate carbon dioxide from coal-fired power plants originated with a Supreme Court decision called Massachusetts v. EPA, where the Supreme Court held that greenhouse gas emissions were subject to the Clean Air Act. After that, former administrator of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, determined that greenhouse gases do contribute to air pollution that is reasonably anticipated to endanger public health and welfare, and those are the key terms to trigger the authority for EPA to then enact regulation after an endangerment finding. So that's kind of how EPA got here, and then how we got here specifically with the new Clean Power Plan was from President Obama's Climate Action Plan, which he unveiled in June of last year. There's several pieces of the Climate Action Plan, some that deal with mobile sources like greenhouse gases from cars and trucks, but we're focused on the stationary source part of that rule of the Climate Action Plan, which is where we get to the regulation of carbon dioxide from new and existing coal-fired power plants. So as you can see from this slide, the first part of this came from the carbon standards for new coal plants under Clean Air Act Section 111B. These regulations were first proposed in March of 2012 and were actually reproposed after a heavy public comment period in September of 2013, and we're still awaiting finalization of that rule. Today, what we'll be covering is the Clean Power Plan, which was just released earlier this month and will regulate carbon dioxide from existing fossil fuel plants under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. It should be noted that the Climate Action Plan set out a 17% reduction by 2020 of carbon dioxide emissions based on a 2005 emission baseline. So now for the basics of the Clean Power Plan, which is what EPA has named the regulations that apply to carbon dioxide reductions from existing power plants. EPA could have proposed their final guidelines several ways, but they've chosen to propose them as state emission goals that are expressed as a rate, so that is pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. EPA does allow states to convert this to a mass-based rate, so an actual tonnage, final tonnage that would be on an annual basis if states choose to limit their carbon that way. EPA also proposed alternate state goals in this proposed rule and the proposed Clean Power Plan, and those are less aggressive but have been included for comment. And I just want to take a second to explain the 2005 versus 2012 baseline in the rules. If anyone has taken a look at the rules, you'll see that each of these state emission goals are built off of the existing emission rates for each state in 2012. EPA is very clear to say that 2012 nor 2005 are, neither one of those is a baseline, quote-unquote baseline in the technical sense. However, EPA used 2012 emission data to base this rule so that they could pick the most recent and most realistic amount of carbon that each state has currently and where they'll have to trend down from. 2005 is still the overall Climate Action Plan goal, but it's just being used as a reference by EPA and is not actually incorporated anywhere into the rule. Now, the Clean Power Plan sets out guidelines for development, submission, and implementation of state plans that each state will have to submit to EPA to show how they will get to each state's individual emission rate goal by 2030. And just so everyone has a sense of really the timeline here, and I should note that this is a rough estimate as litigation, as we know, usually holds up full implementation of these rules, but right now, here's where we think everything will fall into place. The proposed rule was introduced earlier this month, June 2nd, and we'll have a 120-day comment period, which is built into the rule and not perhaps unprecedented that EPA has given this much of a public comment period, but they're really doing their best efforts to ensure that once this is a final rule, it will upstand challenge and be implemented quickly. So currently they have not published the rule in the Federal Register, which starts the 120-day comment period. So we expect that to happen in the next week to 10 days, and that will start the official public comment period. President Obama and his Climate Action Plan instructed EPA to have a final rule by June 2015, published in the Federal Register. And under that timeline, states have another year from 2015 to actually submit their state implementation plans to EPA. Now you'll notice there's actually a range here of 2016 to 2018 for the state implementation plans, and that's because EPA has built in flexibility for states who want to perhaps band together for a regional approach, which I'll talk about more. And they've also built in some exceptions and extensions for states who have special considerations as they dig into exactly how they're going to comply. So once again, EPA's given some flexibility there to ensure everyone has enough time to get this together. The final emission rate goal, so this will be the date that each state has to achieve the percentage reduction that EPA laid out in its state emission guidelines, and that's 2030. So now that we kind of have the basics and a timeline, I wanted to get a little more into the technical parts. Section 111D requires EPA to establish the best system of emission reduction for a pollutant. And this is a term of art from the Clean Air Act. And so what EPA did was looked at a wide range of different emission reduction technologies and approaches and settled on what they're calling the 4 building blocks. And so to be clear, these building blocks are not mandatory for states to use in order to meet their emission rates. These are the 4 areas that EPA identified when combined establish the best system of emission reduction for carbon dioxide from existing coal-fired power plants. So they looked at several measures and then boiled down to these 4, which are 1, increased efficiency of the existing coal-fired power fleet; 2, the increased efficiency and dispatch of existing natural gas combined cycle units; 3 is the increased use of zero carbon generation sources such as your traditional renewable energy like solar and wind, and then nuclear energy. And number 4 is the increased use of demand-side energy efficiency measures. So these are what EPA has determined is the best system of emission reductions for carbon dioxide. And now I want to just give everybody a quick snapshot of what, when EPA took these 4 building blocks and applied them to our Southeast states, what emission rates that ended up with. And we'll dig into each one of these building blocks in more detail. So as you can see here, the Southeast state goals as prescribed in the proposed Clean Power Plan. What you're looking at here is the 2012 emission rate is the second column, which is the unconventional baseline, is what I'll call it, since technically it's not a baseline, but this is where each state was in 2012 as far as pounds per megawatt hour of CO2. EPA established an interim goal for the middle, which is the average emission rate over a 10-year period leading up to the final state goal, the 2030 state goal. And the last final column on the far right are the percentage reduction that each state will have to make from the 2012 emission rates to get to these final state goals that are in red. So as you can see, EPA tried to make this fit for each state so that no state was disadvantaged, which is why you will see that Kentucky, for example, who's over 90% reliant on coal for energy currently, only has an 18% reduction. So that's, allows for the fact that they have some real changes to think about in order to get even to a, 1,700 per megawatt hour CO2 limit. And I should be clear, I've included Louisiana and Virginia, as I knew some on this webinar might be from those states, but these states are not ones that SACE actively works in. So now we have kind of an idea of where each state needs to be and what their goals are. And now I want to dig in a little more to what the building blocks are and how they were used to come up with these final state goals. So building block number 1, as I mentioned, is pretty straightforward. EPA assumed that across the United States coal fleet, it was possible for each coal unit to be upgraded to be more efficient by around 6% efficiency. So this picture here is just kind of trying to illustrate all the different places within the fence of the coal unit where you can make upgrades and get your coal units to actually run more efficiently, which has carbon emission reduction benefits. So this is the first building block. So every coal unit should be able to get 6% more efficient. Building block number 2 is where the natural gas combined cycle play comes in. Now, typically a natural gas combined cycle unit produces less than half as much carbon per megawatt hour as a typical coal unit. And when EPA looked at the current natural gas combined cycle fleet across the nation, it actually found that although we're only running those at about a 40% capacity on average, they're actually can be run much harder and ran as a base load capacity, which is not traditionally how natural gas plants have been thought of. Usually they're peaker plants, so they're turned on when you need the power and turned off when you don't need it. But natural gas combined cycle, EPA finds, is actually a good opportunity to switch from your coal units to natural gas as more of a base load capacity so that you can decrease your carbon emission reductions by relying on natural gas. EPA determined that increasing the utilization of existing natural gas across the nation to around 70% on average is technically feasible and is a means of reducing the state carbon emissions that each state can take advantage of. Now, I should make an important caveat. This does not address any new natural gas combined cycle units, because EPA understands that the infrastructure needed to get that natural gas to each region is different. Some regions right now have more pipelines than others to get there, so they did not assume any new natural gas plants when they came up with their amount of reductions from this building block as they put that into the calculation for each state emission goals. So I just wanted to be clear that this is existing natural gas and does not afford for new build. Building block number 3 are the renewables. There's actually 2 parts I'm calling building block 3 because we have the traditional renewables and the nuclear zero carbon option. And so I'm going to break this out just so we understand that those are 2 very different sources, but both under the building block number 3. So what EPA did to determine how each state, the potential each state has to reduce emission reductions through renewable energy generation, was based on a majority of states who have already adopted renewable portfolio standards. So they looked at what the best practices were across the nation and then whittled that down to 6 regions. Because what EPA was trying to do is afford for the renewable energy in your region and not hold, some of us perhaps in the Southeast to the same levels as maybe an area like the Northwest that just traditionally has more renewable energy. So EPA grouped states into 6 regions, and our region is, luckily for SACE, the exact states that we cover: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And now the next slide, I just wanted to show you really what EPA was assuming when they looked at the renewable capacity in our states. So here you'll see that they've started out once again with a 2012% of renewable energy. And I just kind of add a caveat that we have not dug into these numbers, so I'm not necessarily sure what each of these represents and what all is being counted, because for example, hydropower is not included as renewable energy under the Clean Power Plan. It's not afforded for. But as you can see, EPA has a final goal and a less aggressive alternate final goal for each state. And this is where each state should be as far as percentage of generation provided by renewable energy by 2030 if they're going to see the largest amount of benefits in terms of carbon reduction from their renewable energy sources. So that's renewable energy, building block 3, part 1. And then we have building block number 3, nuclear. So in the building blocks, when they dealt with nuclear, they broke out existing and new nuclear. So EPA recommended preserving existing nuclear units to comply with state emission goals, and they called out Crystal River number 3 in Florida as one that a state might want to recommend holding on to. To be clear, this is merely what EPA has said and is not necessarily mandatory nor necessarily something that SACE supports as a compliance goal, but in the interest of full disclosure, this is everything that EPA has taken into account when setting these rules. So along with existing nuclear, they've also laid out new nuclear, and EPA has included the new nuclear that is proposed to be built into the state goals in which those new nuclear units are related, are located. And they've asked specifically for comment on whether or not these should be included in the state goals and how these should be dealt with. And so I wanted to call that out because coincidentally, every single proposed new nuclear site that EPA mentions in the rule is here in the Southeast. So that's Vogtle Units 3 and 4 in Georgia, Watts Bar 2 in Tennessee, and Summer 2 and 3 in South Carolina. So to be clear and kind of going back, these were, when EPA set the state goals, these were built in, which is why you'll see states like South Carolina have a 51% reduction. And that's because EPA is already assuming that these will be built, which will allow for an easier compliance with those emission reductions. So that's, I mean, I just kind of want to be clear that it's not that they're putting more pressure on South Carolina to reduce than other states. It's that because South Carolina is one of the states that has this existing nuclear, or I'm sorry, proposed nuclear, they've built that in, and that shows up as a larger reduction. And then building block number 4 is demand-side energy efficiency measures. So this is actually customer energy efficiency programs. The way that EPA figured out really what the capacity was for each state also for EE is they looked at each state's reported energy efficiency savings rate on an annual basis, and then they assumed that each state would have about a 0.2% annual growth in their energy efficiency, which should get to every state to 1.5% savings target by 2030. So to say it a different way, that would be each state has to get to 1.5% of their sales on an annual basis as energy efficiency. And likewise with the renewables, here is a chart of really what that meant for our southeastern states. So EPA sets out a 1.5 savings target scenario and shows where each state is. Gives an interim goal for 2020 and then 2029, and then 2030 was when every state should be at 1.5% of savings. So now that we've hopefully understood better the 4 building blocks, which are slightly complicated but make sense in EPA's effort to regulate states considering each of their unique generation portfolios and available renewable energy and energy efficiency resources. Now let's look at actually how this starts getting implemented. As I mentioned before, states under the Clean Power Plan must submit a state implementation plan to EPA. SIPs, which is the informal name for the State Implementation Planner, are a process that states are very familiar with. SIPs are required to show compliance already with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and so the process is not something unfamiliar to states. However, creating a plan that gets to the emission rate goals and is varied enough to allow for a broad range of generation resources and also reliable energy is might be a little more challenging, which is why, as I mentioned before, EPA has given some flexibility on when these SIPs need to be submitted in order to allow for states to have enough time to really dig into each state's unique situation and come up with a SIP that has the 4 general criteria laid out here on this slide. So each SIP must have enforceable emission reductions. They must achieve the emission reductions equal to or better than the ones laid out under the Clean Power Plan. The emission reductions must be quantifiable and verifiable, which means it needs to be clear how many reductions you're getting and from where, and that they're actually being reduced. And then the plan must have built-in adequate reporting requirements so that it's clear that while EPA gets each submissions throughout the plan to kind of benchmark where the state is as we get to the 2030 final goal, that EPA can follow that clearly and adequately through the state plan. It should be noted that if a state fails to submit a SIP or submits an inadequate SIP, that EPA doesn't think will actually get them to the achievable emission reductions, the EPA maintains the ability to submit a federal implementation plan for that state, which actually would take all of the implementation and enforcement of that carbon emission reductions into the federal entity. This is pretty rare. EPA usually likes to let states handle this kind of stuff, so I don't suspect that this will happen, but I just wanted to make it clear that that is what happens should the states fail to get a SIP in time. So then we've gotten the SIPs, and this is how the states will pick and choose really how they want to get into compliance. Like I said, the 4 building blocks are not, it's not necessary that a state take advantage of renewable energy. It's not necessary that they take advantage of efficient capacity upgrades at their coal units. What they have to do, though, is show very clearly how they're going to get to those carbon emission rate goals in 2030. A lot of stuff has been said about rate impacts, and I want to just make it clear that EPA has already figured out if a state relies on energy efficiency as a significant part of their compliance method over the long run, and by the time we get to the 2030 goal, customer bills will actually go down 8%. So it's really important as we think about how the states are going to comply that we understand the implications of choosing each one of those building blocks, because some are more expensive than others and some are more effective than others. So a little more about the compliance options. The SIP, as I mentioned, must be submitted to EPA, but will be created by each state's environmental regulatory body. So, for example, here in Tennessee, where I live, that would be the Tennessee Department of Environmental Conservation. It's my understanding that these environmental regulators are working very closely with their state energy offices, as well as the regulated community and EPA, to make sure that the SIPs are written in such a way that work for both the state and comply with what EPA needs each SIP to contain. The SIPs are approved by EPA after they're submitted, and as I said before, there's the federal implementation plan backstop if a SIP is not adequate. And I also wanted to point out that EPA has built in state hearings in each of the states' SIP approval process. So there'll be more information to come, and I guess keep your eyes open. I'm sure we'll be sending out information when those state hearings are scheduled, although that will not be until after the rule is finalized and we're really in the state implementation process, so that won't be until after 2016 most likely. I wanted to also just call out a couple compliance methods, not getting into too much detail because it's all very complicated, but just to reiterate how much EPA has really given flexibility here. They have one approach that they suggest states could use called the portfolio approach, which could be state-driven or utility-driven. Here in the Southeast, it's more likely to be utility-driven, as most of the coal-fired power plants are owned by utilities. And this method includes emission limits for affected units along with other enforceable measures. So that would include renewable energy and demand-side energy efficiency measures to reduce CO2. So it gives the full portfolio of energy choices, wraps those all into a state implementation plan that will end up getting these amount of emission reductions. And what's good about the utility-driven portfolio approach is that it can line up with the utility's integrated resource planning process. And so it just makes it a little more streamlined and easier for utilities to think really when they make these important decisions about their generation resources, to wrap that into the compliance and plans around the Clean Power Plan carbon emission reductions. There's also a state commitment approach, which implements state enforceable measures to achieve a specified portion of the emission performance. And this just, to be clear, is just a variation that allows the states to have the full responsibility, but allows states to be kind of the creditors across all of the units and to make sure that renewable energy and energy efficiency measures are being counted correctly and adequately. So this could be a good approach for states who already have that type of emission reduction credit already built in. And then lastly, EPA is allowed to, what Gina McCarthy called, let states play together, which is a regional approach like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast and the California carbon trading. And this has a lot of cost-effective benefits to it. We're kind of just starting to dig into what the pros and cons would be for the Southeast. But since many of our Southeast utilities, like the Tennessee Valley Authority and Southern Company and Duke, span several states, it seems a little intuitive that they might be in favor of banding together and creating kind of a carbon trading market amongst themselves, just like the Reggie and California examples. So it remains to be seen if our states will take that course, but I wanted to make everyone aware that that is definitely a possibility under this plan. And so as long as everyone's still awake with us here, that was kind of the high-level points of the Clean Power Plan. I'm going to kick it over to Jen Renix now to talk a little more about what we've seen since these rules have come out.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for a very detailed rundown of what we know from, and I do want to point out it's over a 650-page proposed rule, so it has taken quite a lot of effort in the last 2 weeks to read through and distill down to 20 slides, so thank you so much for that. Very quickly, I'm just going to go over a little bit of what we've seen from the states since EPA announced the rule, some of the actions that have followed here. Probably most notably, because this also affected several other states, but the senator from Kentucky, Senator Mitch McConnell, called the regs a dagger in the heart of the middle class. That was his quote the day they were introduced, and he introduced a bill known as the Coal Country Protection Act, and the idea was this to go forward and put legislation on the books to block this rule from ever being implemented. However, the bill was blocked procedurally in the Senate and at least for now will not go forward, but there were other Southeastern senators that joined and supported this bill, notably Tennessee Senators Alexander and Corker were two of a group of senators who co-sponsored the bill. So that was sort of the first flurry. Then in several of our other states, I'll note that in South Carolina, there was initially some backlash in the media against this proposed plan because of, as Angela noted, that 51% target cut in carbon reductions. If you just look at the numbers completely separate from any context, that obviously looks like a much bigger number than, let's say, in Kentucky, where it's proposed, I believe it was 18%. So that seems very disparate. However, again, as you look at where they're deriving the numbers and where there are already new plants projected to come online and or coal retirements already announced, those numbers become a little more clarified. Tennessee, and we've heard a bit from the CEO of the Tennessee Valley Authority, Bill Johnson, on this. TVA is in a good place, and thus Tennessee is in a good place due to the commitments that TVA has already made to date in terms of retirement and some of the work that has been going on to a lesser degree with renewables and efficiency. And likewise in Florida, that there hasn't been a lot of specific commentary or backlash. Florida also may be in a decent place depending on what goes forward with the plans. However, I would note there has been a little bit of backlash from some of the elected officials in Florida who very prominently display the fact that they are climate change deniers and not scientists, but don't believe in climate change, and so there may well be considerable backlash from them as we go forward with this rule. And then finally in Georgia, the Georgia Public Service Commission, Commissioner Stan Wise did release a prepared statement today that the Clean Power Plan was proposed, but that notwithstanding, Georgia Power has made some very significant strides in retiring coal plants and increasing renewable energy resources, which have been approved by the Georgia Public Service Commission, bringing on more solar and wind. So Georgia may also be in a good place as we move forward. And again, all of these are a little difficult to project right now because it's all going to come down to exactly how the states write their state implementation plans and how heavily they choose to rely on resources like efficiency. And we haven't seen very much else from some of the other states, not yet. There was certainly some initial commentary from these states last year when the new coal plant proposal was put forward, but a little less so in recent weeks. And all right, if we could just move on, I want to close the webinar by giving a little bit of information both to individuals that are on this call as well as organizations that may be on this call. As Angela pointed out, we have a several-year timeline right now, so nothing is going to move quickly, but in the very near term, there are opportunities now to submit comments that are supportive for this rule, or submit comments just across the board. So there are ways to submit comments to the EPA directly. Of course, also another way of submitting comments is to your local papers. Letter to the editor certainly shows that you are supportive of this proposal and all that will come with it. And then, of course, social media has been a very interesting way of drawing attention to this rule in the weeks before it was rolled out and since then. So we are certainly seeing a lot of that from individuals as well as organizations. And of course, we do encourage anybody who is part of an organization on this call to encourage your members and supporters to be a part of the process through submission of LTEs, letters to the editor, also generating comments to the EPA directly and to the state agencies that will be implementing and first developing and then implementing the state plans. And then something else we want to point out, I will talk for a moment about an official EPA hearing that is going to be held here in the Southeast, but something that we at SACE would very strongly encourage is that at every state here in the Southeast to host a citizens hearing to help spread awareness about the proposal, about what is going on, about the impacts that this will have on a state-by-state basis, because these are quite specific, and also boosting comments. So that is certainly, there are countless opportunities to do that. There's, you could have anywhere between one and dozens of citizen hearings, depending on how that was organized. And but I do want to talk now for just a moment about the upcoming EPA hearing. There will be 4 hearings held across the country: Denver, Colorado, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta, Georgia. So on Tuesday, July 29th, there will be a day-long hearing in Atlanta, Georgia at the Federal Center. There is significant information out there about it already. You do have to register to speak ahead of time. There's information on SACE's website, and I'm sure dozens of other organizations that have called into this call also have information available on their websites, but we are encouraging people to register and speak and make your voice heard. There will be a day of activities happening there in Atlanta. There will most likely be a press conference. So if you are interested and if you have more questions, please feel free to get in touch with Angela or myself or other people who are involved with planning for this hearing in approximately a month's time. And with that, I think we're going to go to questions. I know there are many questions that we have in the queue, and so I will just go ahead and say that we may not be able to get to all of them during the time we have slotted for this webinar, but Angela, are you good to begin taking questions now from the staff?
Yep. And thank you all for your questions. Like Jen said, if I can't get to them today, I will get to them later, so they will not go unanswered. The first question that I wanted to tackle here is, can you clarify the target scenarios versus the alternate target scenarios for the 4 building blocks? So EPA, and this is where it gets complicated, established these target scenarios for states under the building blocks, which were the the spreadsheets you saw for the renewable energy and energy efficiency resources, and what those are EPA's best guess estimates for where the state should be in terms of both energy efficiency and renewables by the 2030 timeline in order to get the most amount of carbon emission reductions from those building blocks. So they're not goals in the traditional sense. It's not necessary for Florida to increase its renewable energy to X amount in order to comply with the carbon rules. This is just where EPA is saying what they need to get to in order to really get the full benefit of that building block. The final target, which is the emission rate, is what EPA is proposing to be the enforceable emission rate goal of 2030 for compliance for the Clean Power Plan. In the proposed rule, which I should make it very clear that this is a proposed rule, which means EPA has taken comment on everything under the sun that I mentioned and more. So if you have concerns about how things are being counted, how things are being considered, dig in and comment, because EPA is definitely all ears in the comment period. They even did kind of an unprecedented unofficial comment period before the rules came out, where they engaged with stakeholders across the board to figure out really what would work best for each state and for the nation as a whole. So that, I hope, is a little clearer on what the target scenarios versus the actual target are. Additionally, EPA proposed alternate goals, both for the emission rate goal and alternate target scenarios that would get you to that alternate emission rate goal. And those are lower goals. I didn't really want to dig into those, but they're out there, and people can comment on them if they feel that the alternate goal is more appropriate, or if they even feel that none of the goals are and they should be more aggressive. So I hope that answered that question. Another question that I can get rid of pretty quickly is, why isn't hydropower included in the calculation of zero carbon sources, and how will hydro be factored into SIPs? Once again, another topic that EPA is open for comment on. I believe because of the lack of hydro resources across many states and the not very clear opportunity to increase hydro resources just because of the capital costs and infrastructure constraints there, they opted to not include them in the Clean Power Plan. Now, because the emission rate for a state is the emission rate across the entire generation portfolio of the state, obviously hydro is going to be factored in and will decrease the emission rate based on how much hydro you use, since it is a zero carbon resource. But for the purposes of this rule, it has not been integrated, but if you think it should be, that's another thing you can get back to EPA on.
And Angela, let me just pop in here and say, just send a reminder to everybody that if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You just type them in, and they will come into us, and we'll take as many as we can. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so kind of moving right along to questions, and there were a lot. Another question was, the life cycle emissions analysis of natural gas shows that methane pollution is a significant greenhouse gas. Does EPA have any plans to incorporate life cycle emissions, perhaps in its final draft? I haven't seen anything about the life cycle emissions in the rule. My guess, and once again, it's a huge rule with about 600 pages of technical documents that also accompany the already 650-page rule, so I can't really say anything, conclusive, but it's my understanding that life cycle emissions were not incorporated because of the difficulty of tracking those and including all of those from, when you dig the coal out of the ground to when you burn it, along with, shipping it around, and the same thing goes for natural gas as far as including the greenhouse gases that come from the production and extraction of natural gas. So EPA is open for any comments. I think you can probably even comment on something that's not included in the rule if you think it should have been. So definitely, if you have concerns about the methane leakage from natural gas, which is a real concern, because methane is a six times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon. I think that's definitely something that should be included in your comments. Okay, let's see. Another question. Have any of the major utilities in the region commented publicly about the rules? I believe, once again, I can't say really conclusively because I haven't seen every single statement from the Southeast, but for example, Jen mentioned the Tennessee Valley Authority has had several statements. CEO Bill Johnson has been on several news programs talking about how TVA is in a really good place. They have already had really aggressive coal retirements and are on track already to be, I think, about 40% below their 2005 levels by 2020. So, TVA has come out really saying that this is a positive thing and that they're ready to comply. I haven't seen really anything out there from Duke or Southern Company necessarily, besides acknowledging that these rules are important and will affect their generating resources. If anybody on this webinar has seen those, feel free to shoot those over to me as I'm trying to really keep up with what's happening across the region. And here I'll just go ahead and advance to the slide that has Jen and our information on there. Let's see. Next question. What instruments has SACE seen in the rule that would be available to citizens who are striving to move further faster? I'm assuming that this rule this question is about really what tools are there for citizens to push to be more aggressive, these rules to be more aggressive. I think, not only is getting involved in the official public comment, submitting written comments. If you are located near Atlanta and can attend the July 29th hearing, that's an excellent opportunity. I think everyone gets five minutes to speak, although I would recommend contacting EPA immediately about that, as I think the spots are filling up. And then also, as Jen mentioned, holding public citizen hearings. So we've actually met with EPA Region 4 to talk about their, what they think about the rule, but also their availability if areas wanted to have an EPA representative come and kind of help explain a little better and have a dialogue. I think that's definitely something EPA Region 4 is open to. So, you can contact me and I can try to set you up with the right person there if you'd like to hold something in your city, if you're not so close to Atlanta. And other than that, I would just get the message out as much as you can. If listservs, we've been blogging a lot on it. There's a lot of resources on EPA's website to kind of boil down into digestible facts about what this rule is. So I just, it's kind of a full arsenal approach there on how you'd like to get involved. And if you have further questions, please contact Jen or me on that. Let's see. Another question is there anything in the Clean Power Plan about converting coal-fired power plants to biomass? I don't recall seeing anything about biomass in the rule, actually. They do talk a lot about fuel switching from coal to natural gas. I think that's an opportunity. Biomass is an opportunity for emission reductions. I'm not a biomass expert at all, so I think for those of you interested in that resource, that would be, a big comment, is to say, where's biomass in this rule? And I would be clear that when we talk to EPA, they really are looking for relevant, helpful comments. So, it never hurts to say, we're in support of the rule, that's great, send those in. But if you are an expert or know an expert on some of these more granular topics like biomass, hydropower, I would strongly suggest getting those comments in the public comment period, because it's, I do believe EPA is taking all of these comments very seriously and, could be persuaded to include things or exclude things that they have in the rule right now.
And Angela, this is Jen Renix, and I would note that we do have someone on staff, John Bonnets, who is beginning to delve very carefully into this rule from a biomass and bioenergy perspective, and so people are welcome to contact John through SACE with specific biomass questions, and hopefully he will be able to provide a little bit more advice and direction in terms of that specific component.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Jen. That's right. We don't think I don't think biomass is in there now, but John will be happy to talk to you about really its implications for the Clean Power Plan. Let's see. Another question is, are emission targets at production level or consumption level? So the emission targets are the amount of carbon dioxide emitted per megawatt hour, the pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So that's a production level rate. So the amount of megawatt hours that are the utility produces in a year, they'll have a specific tons per megawatt hour rate to go across the states. Here's a question that's near and dear to my heart since I mostly work on TVA. How will regulation go with TVA since Tennessee has no power over TVA? Well, it's a little, that statement's not exactly true. So Tennessee, TVA is a federal public power provider, so they have been created by an act of Congress and are ruled by the board of directors of the TVA. But they do have to comply with federal regulations and have complied with federal regulations for, national ambient air quality standards to water quality standards. So they don't exist in an unregulated bubble. So TVA is definitely working with EPA and the Tennessee regulators to map a way of compliance because really TVA is already there. We'll most likely not have to do much more to get there. So they're really working with TDEC to get that hammered out and show full compliance with the rule. So another question about the logistics of the Atlanta meeting. Is there a link where we can make statements or comments, or will that come out after being advertised in the Federal Register? Where do we provide comments for the Atlanta, Georgia meeting? So those are two questions, actually. The first one, yes, EPA is actually already taking comments. If you go on the EPA, you just Google EPA Carbon or Clean Power Plan, will bring you to the landing page of EPA's Clean Power Plan on their website, and that has a link to where you can click to submit comments officially.
And Angela, I can offer an even simpler one. If you go to cleanenergy.org, one of the hot topics says show your support for limits on carbon pollution. And if you click on that, that takes you to a landing page with information not only about the hearing and how to register for the hearing, but also it will allow you to directly submit a comment to the EPA under this docket number, and you can use your own words or you can use some of the provided talking points, but there are and many other organizations are also collecting comments, but you can begin submitting those as early as today, even though it hasn't officially published yet in the Federal Register.
Great, yeah, right, Jen. That's much more helpful. And then for where do we provide comments for the Atlanta, Georgia meeting? I mean, those are, as my understanding, is just in-person comments. So you can find out more information on that meeting from the page that Jen just mentioned on our website. Okay, another question that just came in, what do you expect to see in terms of economic impacts of the carbon limits? This is a really big question for a lot of people, including the regulated community and states. Because this is a proposed rule and it merely serves as a guideline for how states can comply, and really the only, quote unquote firm mandate in the rule are these emission limits. It's unclear what the economic effect could be. We won't really even know what the state emission limits are until the rule is finalized. But as I stated earlier, as states begin to think about crafting these state implementation plans, it will become important for them to look at the least cost options, lower cost options, which is where demand-side energy efficiency really comes in. It can be a really useful tool to reduce carbon emissions while not having a major impact on customer rates. Now, in terms of a positive economic impact, if states build more renewable energy and implement more demand-side energy efficiency resources because of this rule and as a compliance method, you will see a increase in the economies of for example, the Southeast. You can't outsource energy efficiency jobs. Those will definitely be local jobs. The same for renewable energy installations. So it could definitely be an economic boon depending on how states really craft these state implementation plans. So that'll remain to be seen, the true economic impacts. Another question that someone has asked here is what might happen if a state doesn't meet its goal or doesn't wish to comply? What's the enforcement mechanism? So I think there's kind of two parts of what happens if a state doesn't act right under this rule. The first one is if the state doesn't, as I mentioned before, doesn't submit a state implementation plan. That's where the EPA can come in as a backstop and implement a federal implementation plan, which gives them the enforceable and implementary, role in that state's emission reduction plan. And then there's also on the back end, once the state implementation plan is put in place, and if a state is not complying with its plan, there are multiple enforcement measures, just like any SIP, where the EPA will enforce either fines or other types of penalties if the state is not meeting these kind of benchmark goals. And they'll also work with states to figure out why they aren't and how they can. So I hope that has answered most of the questions. If we haven't gotten to your question, I'll be following up later via email. And also, if you have any ones that come to you, after you've had time to think about this, you can always shoot me or Jen a question, and our email addresses are here on the screen. So I'll pass it over to Chris to end up. And I really appreciate everyone's attention because this is a really wonky, weighty rule. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Jen. I do want to close out with just comments came in with specific concerns about a specific fuel source or maybe specific support for one particular building block like renewables or efficiency. Jen and Angela, can you just close us out with one last answer on if people have feelings about how they can make their preferences heard on this, who they should get a hold of? Should it be the EPA, the state agencies, et cetera?
Sure.
Yeah, this is Angela. I can help, and Jen, you can chime in. If you, for example, let's say you're a big fan of solar, it's important to begin to have the dialogues with perhaps your state energy offices or your state environmental regulators to kind of push that message and help educate them about the benefits of renewable energy, not only as an emission reduction tool but also as an economic driver for the Southeast, et cetera, et cetera. I think you can get that message out to on the state level to the two entities I just referred to. You can definitely get into the public comment period with EPA and get the message out there. You can help organize citizens around promoting that message and showing, it's really strong support that we want, increased use of solar, for example, in Tennessee to comply. So I think, there's a couple of different playing fields you can play on with those messages, and the state energy offices, they're going to be looking at this whole time between now and the final rule, and be thinking about, now they're going to have to even start thinking about what a state implementation plan looks like. So the earlier you can get those messages in and start kind of having those dialogues with these players, I think the better. Jen, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add.
Well, just very briefly, I think that was great, Angela. And the other thing I would say is I would urge people not to forget the court of public opinion. Submitting an opinion editorial or a letter to the editor of your local paper is another way of getting on the record. I wouldn't encourage people to do that in lieu of submitting official comments to either your state agencies or to the Environmental Protection Agency, but I do believe if you have specific preferences or specific concerns, now is the time, because this is a long process, but much like a wedding ceremony, we will reach a point where speak now or forever hold your peace, and these will begin rolling forward, and so now is the time to engage for sure.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Jen. Thank you, Angela. Thank you all of our attendees for being with us and attending the webinar today. This and all of our webinars are supported by our members. If you are interested in becoming a member today, please go to cleanenergy.org/donate. This webinar has also been recorded, and we will be posting this on our website very soon in the next few days, and we will send you a link when it's been posted. And that is everything. So thank you again, and have a good day.